How's everybody doing this morning? I'm sure we'll have a few more people dribbling in, the rain. We had 150 people register for this, so I always joke free means half the people show up, but appreciate everybody coming out this morning. This is a topic that is obviously very timely on a national basis, but as you'll see some of our speakers and the information that they have, I really worry about opioids here in Houston. Houston has been mercifully spared from heroin for kind of a lot of years, and opioids have not been terribly big here. I'm not entirely sure why, but I keep telling people this plague is coming. I really worry about the numbers that we're seeing in the laboratory and the growth that we're seeing in opioid cases and the really strong opioids, fentanyl, carfentanil, and the fentanylogs, as they like to get called. That growth is really troubling to me. So I will keep talking with any and all politicians about that. I would encourage you to as well, because we're at a place that we might be able to change this. But if it comes as the wave that it has elsewhere in the country, we're in trouble. Just a few, let's see, I've been given instructions of some of the things I need to say. So I do want to thank Rice University and their public relations department for providing us the space today. See, Frank Medina's brother, David Medina, was one that helped us with that. And Frank, we've got a couple of board members here today. Sandy Thompson and Nicole Caceres are both here from our board. I'm not sure if we have any other board members that are here today. Who else? Tracy is our, let's see, you are the city representative. There's another name for it, it's just not coming to me. Ex officio, that's the name I'm looking for, ex officio member of our board. So thank you, appreciate your coming today. Also, Phil Hilder, yep, there's the other one. Phil, I know I saw you. Phil Hilder's another one of our board members. So Houston Forensic Science Center is kind of an unusual thing that it is a local government corporation, and our board are my boss. They have a responsibility for the laboratory. They are all uncompensated citizens that are very concerned about justice issues in the city of Houston, and really any opportunity I can take to thank them for their support. It is an enormous commitment of their time and an enormous commitment of their effort in doing what Houston has become. So really thank you all for your support. Thank Quality Forensic Toxicology, the table tents there, they provided sponsorship, and the breakfast, thank you. It's the first time we've really tried sponsorship for this, so thank you for experimenting with us about how to do that. And, oh yes, we have, there's 2-hour CLE credit for this, so those of you lawyers in the room, please sign up for the CLE credit. And obviously the speakers. All of their bios are in the program there, so I won't read through bios. I think, do we have Representative Coleman here? They're waiting for him. Okay. Well, how about we do him later? So first up is Judge Brock Thomas, and discussing about some of the things in the docketing of controlled substances cases in the Houston area. So, if you will, thank you.
First of all, thank you for having me here this morning. I know we each of us have a space of about 15 minutes to at least provide a little overview of kind of why we're here and part of this panel to discuss the impact of opioids on the justice system. I'll save some of the things that I can dive into greater detail later. It's hard in 15 minutes to kind of explain all the things that we're doing. But just from a general perspective, I preside over what is referred to as the Responsive Interventions for Change docket, the RIC docket in Harris County. When we discuss the issue of opioids' impact on the justice system, typically from a judge perspective, the questions people tend to ask boil down into a couple of different areas. What is the scope of the problem from a justice standpoint, and what are you doing about it? And so I will, in the 15 minutes or so I have before we pass it along, and later on I'll get into more detail about it, I want to address those two things. But to get an understanding of the impact of opioids on the justice system and what we're doing about it, I have to give a little bit of background of how we've changed how we deal with substance use cases from an overall perspective and the significance of that change and how it affects what we do specifically with regard to opioid cases. Back in 2015 it began, but in 2016 Harris County had applied for, and a number of people in this room were part of that as stakeholders, through the MacArthur Foundation, a Safety Justice Challenge, which the overall nationwide challenge was to safely reduce jail populations, safely and effectively do that, and to do that in order also to reduce racial and ethnic disparities within that population. Harris County stakeholders got together to address what are some of the different ways we may be able to safely and effectively do that. And one of the things that was identified was how we were processing and handling our lower level drug cases, and specifically our less than a gram felony cases and our 1 to 4 gram felony cases. The emphasis at first was more on the less than a gram, which by definition is going to include a large number of your less than a gram, for example, heroin cases and opiate cases that come into the justice system at a felony level. What was identified in looking at that was that obviously the numbers, a lot of those individuals were getting jail time, serving jail time, cycling through the system over and over again, and that there was identified that if we took a different and better and smarter approach to that, that hopefully we could make a significant impact in that. Historically, just for some perspective, before we began the responsive interventions for change docket, we have 22 criminal district courts in Harris County. So when somebody is charged with a felony criminal case, and that includes less than a gram, 1 to 4 gram, your low-level possession cases, they are randomly assigned through 22 district courts and can go to any of those 22 district courts. 22 different judges, 22 different sets of prosecutors assigned to those courts, staff, and everything that goes along with that. The idea was, what if we could take those level cases, try to do something meaningful and different than that, and rather than have those being spread apart through those 22 dockets, what if we put those in one place to try to drill down and make a meaningful impact on those type of cases? Oops, sorry. So as part of the Safety Justice Challenge, what was created was our Responsive Interventions for Change docket, which that took all of those cases that were distributed amongst those 22 cases and placed them in one docket. That's the docket that I preside over. That's the docket that a lot of folks I'll introduce to you later serve with me on and help run that particular docket. And the idea is to take a more therapeutic approach to those cases as appropriate and try to divert individuals away from jail towards appropriate treatment and services. Because one thing we've learned over time clearly when it comes to substance use, abuse, and misuse, treatment, confinement is not working in terms of making an impact on that. Appropriate treatment works, and so we needed to find better ways to try to marshal resources to move the needle and get some results when it comes to that. And so that's the creation and the background of the docket. What we are is really a collaborative effort between the district courts. The Board of Judges agreed to have all of these cases directly filed through one docket. Again, if we can resolve the case there, and I'll talk about the different ways that we resolve it through some type of diversion to therapeutic programming, we do. We get individuals that are accused of things that they have not done or wish to have a trial or motion to suppress. We have a process to where those cases can get to the place they need to for those things to happen. But where we can deal with them, we certainly seek to do so. But we are really a collaboration between the district courts that allow these cases to come through one place, the district attorney's office that has prosecutors with a special emphasis and training with regard to this, that take an approach that we're going to, as appropriately, try to divert people away from confinement towards therapeutic programming, and we're doing that in large numbers, much differently than we've done before since the implementation of this docket. We also have defense attorneys that are assigned to us. Obviously, hired lawyers are part of it, but certainly we have many individuals that are indigent. We use private attorneys who do indigent defense work, as well as also the public defender's office who are part of it. Pretrial services, we have special officers that are there with us. We also have probation officers that are with us that are specifically trained and focused in on this particular population to help us with it. Houston Recovery Center, I know Leonard will talk in a little bit, and we utilize and contract with his group to have recovery coaches that are actually in place in the courtroom with us on a daily basis. Many of you are familiar with the growing use of recovery coaches. They are an invaluable tool to us What's different about us is that they're with us every day and part of our docket. And we also have the Harris Center, so we have a lot of individuals that in addition to substance use issues are dealing with mental health issues as well, and we can kind of leverage that. I'm kind of trying to describe something that's really better seen than explained, but the idea again was to peel off those cases from going to 22 different places with all those different responses to it, to try to get them in one place and appropriately marshal resources and quickly and appropriately try to address the issues that are going on and get people linked with the right kinds of things. I'm not sure what's getting the feedback there.
They're playing with it back there.
All right.
You're fine.
So of the cases that we have, again, we get all the less than 1 gram cases, we get all the 1 to 4 gram cases of possession of controlled substance and prostitution, 4th cases. We are clearly not getting in our docket every single case where there is an opioid-related matter or a use issue that's going on, but obviously we're getting a large proportion of those since we're getting what used to go to 22 places in 1 place. So we certainly get a chance to see that. These are the different options that you can see in terms of what we do. First offenders typically being offered, if appropriate, a pretrial diversion, which is a chance to get programming, a dismissal of their case after the completion of that programming, linked with whatever that appropriate programming is, or deferred adjudication, where people are placed on probation with appropriate supervision and programming. I'll talk about this in more detail later. But the thing that allows us to do, again, is to marshal resources and address these quickly. As it relates specifically to the opioid-related matters, I will tell you in terms of numbers, how big is the problem, how big is the issue for us. That's a very difficult thing to address. In terms of how we track cases, we can track and we know how many less than 1 gram cases are filed. We know how many 1 to 4 gram cases are filed, which is about 5,000 in Harris County per year. That's just the cases that are filed in that. There are still obviously other cases out there where there's an opioid-related issue that maybe they're charged with a different type of offense, or what they're actually arrested for may not necessarily pick up that they have that substance use issue that's an opioid-related matter. But when we look at that, we certainly know and understand that it is a growing concern and a growing problem we have. We know that it's getting bigger. We know also that in terms of the resources that we utilize, especially with our treatment alternatives, our higher end users or higher end utilization of our, for example, our inpatient treatment things, because of with the opiate cases and specifically with the heroin and the fentanyl matters, obviously they're highly addictive and there's great risk of overdose that comes with those. So even though it's still not near the number in terms of size compared to cocaine cases and meth cases, for example, it's growing. And obviously with those that we're dealing with, a lot of those proportionally are using a higher end of our high-end resources that are needed for treatment, and that's understandable. So it's really hard to put a number to it other than to say it's significant, it's growing, but it is still not, at least here, the size and scope of the issues that we still have with cocaine, meth, and some of the other substances as well. What we are able to do, because those cases come through us, and that's all that we deal with, we are able to see quickly and right away the types of cases, the circumstances that are going on. Now, mind you, when cases are first filed and we're dealing with, these are pre-trial matters. And so certainly the attorneys would understand this, and all of us would understand. These are not yet individuals that have been found guilty of anything or pled guilty to anything, so obviously there are sensitivities to navigating appropriately supervision of what's going on with these individuals and that there is a felony case, but also being mindful that there has been no conviction and there's no resolution of the case. So we are able to see what are the circumstances that brought the person in front of us, what is the history, are there things in terms of, while we will do appropriate supervision and testing, for example, are there things that our attorneys, our staff can recognize to appropriately link people right away, not necessarily having to wait to the point to where there's disposition of the case if people are in need of linkage to recovery coaches or other types of support services. If they're in need of detox, things like that, that's a significant issue that we deal with. We deal with everything because we deal with people that come to court, make it to court, don't have an issue with it. We have people that are still very much in the middle of an addiction and that come to court or under the influence, drove, all those other things. So there's all kinds of sensitivities that go into that and trying to do the right thing with that. But being able to see those cases quickly and getting people linked quickly, that's one of the things that we're able to do through having this in one docket. We utilize our recovery coaches significantly. folks that have kind of been through this, walked in the shoes of the folks that are with us, and can address concerns, issues, things that may be on the individual's minds that we can help with. We provide those. We don't make people link with those, but we provide those at least initially at that pretrial stage to where them or family members can benefit from having a recovery coach, services that they're able to link people up to help navigate that space until there's a resolution of the case, which is a significant issue with the opioid-related cases, again, because of how highly addictive they are, and certainly the risk of overdose that comes especially with our IV users that we're able to identify. When it comes to what we do with the cases and how we're handling it, again, getting an understanding of how differently we're handling all the substance cases is important. There's an emphasis through this docket, and we have done this in the 2 years that we've been in existence, to where the number of people for these kinds of cases that were getting confinement as opposed to some type of diversion to either deferred adjudication or pretrial intervention with treatment, whereas before the majority of these people were getting confinement, we have flipped that, and now through this effort and through what we're seeking to do, more of these individuals are getting either pretrial intervention, getting deferred adjudication, and getting linked with appropriate services. But again, diversion is a big topic within the overall umbrella of criminal justice reform and all the things that are going on, and certainly we're a big believer in that, but that's a big word. Diversion means a lot of things. But one thing we have learned, and certainly we all should know, is that when we're talking about diversion, it's not just about diverting people away from jail, it's also diverting them towards things that can be helpful and beneficial to them to have them succeed. And that's where making sure that we have an assessment, everybody that's placed on a deferred or pretrial intervention is getting an assessment to help us, bottom line, identify what's going on, what can we target, what can we identify that needs to be addressed, what's the appropriate level of treatment and linkage we need to make with somebody so that they can succeed in this endeavor and hopefully finish out whatever their court obligation is, and hopefully do it in a way that they don't continue to cycle through the system again and again. And I'm going through this quickly and we'll discuss it later on, but we use all of the different resources that you can imagine. Everything from lower level outpatient treatment in the community to higher level outpatient treatment both in the community, either through different providers in the community or through our probation department, which we work with. Everybody is being supervised at some level by probation that is on any of these pretrial interventions or defers. But using community-based treatment options that are out there, also secure residential treatment, everything you can imagine when you're dealing with 5,000 cases that come your way and all the substance cases, we're utilizing all of that. But the idea is focusing specifically on identifying when we see that there's an opiate use issue, whether it's identified by the type of case that the person comes with or through the assessment, even if that's not the case that they were arrested on, if there is identified that there is an opiate use issue, either misuse or abuse, that we're able to link people with the appropriate treatment in doing that. That's key to this, but we're very attuned to looking for and flagging those particular situations, again, because of how highly addictive the opiates are and the great risk of overdose. So I'll save time later to talk in more detail about what we do, and I know it's kind of hard to absorb it all and explain it all in a 15-minute window. But some of the specific things that we are doing through this docket, through being able to have this concentrated effort and leverage the resources through one place, is, of course, when we're diverting people to some type of appropriate treatment and services, we have to make sure we're doing the best we can to link people to the appropriate things, the appropriate level of treatment. It's not to their benefit or ours to have something that's too low or too high. We need to make sure we're doing the best we can to get it right. It's not an appropriate use of resource, and it's not good for the individual if we're not able to link people with the right level of what they need. So we're very careful to make sure we do that. We're also very sensitive when it comes to the opioid cases of making sure whatever type of treatment that they're doing, that we're watching and monitoring the aftercare portion of it. One thing many of you know and will see is that when people have been confined, for example, and are heavy at opiate users, heroin addicts, things like that, people are at grave risk for overdose if they've been confined, go back out to the street and begin to use at the same levels that they used prior to their confinement. Same principle applies to inpatient treatment. So there's a lot of strategies that go into making sure, whether it's on the medical side that I'll address it, or on the aftercare and how the counseling and going into that, but that's something that we certainly understand, recognize, and are very careful with. And I know Leonard and others can speak to that better than I, the sensitivities of that and making sure we get that right. We can do all kinds of great things with linking people with the right treatment, but we really got to watch that space when people are getting out of that confined setting or that secure setting to back out in the community when they're struggling with that issue. Because as sensitive as it is to the risk of overdose, that amps up greatly in terms of risk of death in that particular scenario. We also utilize linkage and referrals to medically assisted treatment, which I know others will speak to. To be clear, I do not as a judge, and we do not require as a program that anybody participate in medically assisted treatment, and there are all kinds out there, and forgive me if I bounce between the generic names and the brand names, but everything from methadone, which has been used, to Suboxone, to things like Vivitrol, to Narcan, to all the different types of different things that are out there that are used, and how they're used along the spectrum of things. We want to make sure that people are given information about that they get the chance to talk to that with the appropriate medical professionals and make the decisions with medical professionals about whether that's right and appropriate and for the particular individual. So we certainly make information available. We certainly work with people that are participating and utilizing it, and that's one of the things that's obviously being utilized to a significant extent and growing when it comes to opioid-related matters. We also make sure that we are, again, through leveraging our resources and the team we have together, linking people with support services, whether it's for them or family members, because a lot of times, obviously, the family members are struggling right along with and trying to help out their loved ones who are battling with these issues, to be able to link them with other kinds of education to where they have more of an understanding of what's going on, what the risks are, but also linkage to support groups and services that are out there. There are a number of different ones out there in the community. I know Leonard, through his group, has resources that we have linked people to with regard to that. I know the Council on Recovery and many others have and do, so I'm not going to touch on everyone, but we want to make sure that we're providing that information. And as part of that, linking to family support groups. And then circling back to what is very key to us is linking people with peer specialists, peer-to-peer resources and recovery coaches, linking folks with people that have shared this experience, lived through this, managed through this, succeeding at this. We can talk all day long as a justice system about what people need to do and how they need to do it and provide resources, but I can't stress to you enough the value of having somebody coming at it from a different perspective of that shared experience to be able to help work along with these individuals. So I'll save time for later and talk in more detail about kind of how we do and what we do, but the overall sense of it is we have changed in Harris County through this responsive interventions for change docket, through the MacArthur Foundation, the Safety Justice Challenge, how we approach and deal with substance cases, those lower level felonies, how we deal with those completely, and obviously as a result of that, that has affected how we have differently changed the approach that we take to dealing with the opioid-related matters as well. So I'll look forward to later on the questions and talking in more detail.
Thank you. Just a little reminder about how we kind of set the format up on this. So we'll run through the speakers here, and then we've got lots of time for questions, for interaction with the panel. I've got some questions to ask, but we'll just kind of hang on to questions for now. We got lots of time for questions after. We have found out that Representative Coleman is ill, so he won't be joining with us. So we're doing good on time, even though we started a little late thanks to rain and other things. Next speaker that we have is Paul Speaker, who's from University of West Virginia. I've worked a fair number of years with Paul around the economics of crime laboratories, and he runs a program called Foresight, which is basically a business and economic evaluation of laboratories around the country. Paul?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. I operate a program that we've been doing for the last decade called Project Foresight, and it was primarily to provide laboratory management with some business metrics to help make decisions along the way. And we've continued to collect data, as I said, for the last decade and have a few things. So some of this certainly deals with the opioid crisis. While that crisis is not to crisis level here in my home state, it is. We are the worst in the country when you talk about deaths per capita. And so part of what I'm going to be talking about here today is our project, the White House report that came out last November from the Council of Economic Advisors on what the cost is and run you through some of this and some of these impacts, as well as some of the things that you might not think directly are affecting laboratories. So a little bit about Project Foresight. What we look for here is cross-disciplinary work. We collect from laboratories data on their casework, data on their personnel, and on their expenditures, and try to get a sense of how things are working their way through here. Last year we had 139 laboratory systems worldwide that participated. So we are collecting a good bit of data, and of course Houston is a part of that study. We have data that goes back to 2005. We're using this to help advise policymakers as well as laboratory management itself. We have about 30 publications that have come out of this project, and so I've got the website there at WVU where you can link to any of these and try to get a little sense of what comes on with this. And we've been talking, because we've been looking at the opioid crisis as one of our major topics. One of the others that we've been dealing with this year is dealing with the backlog of sexual assault kits nationwide, and some of the policies and what the returns are by dealing with this. So our discussions on the medico-legal aspects of this, it's not just with forensic laboratories. We're having conversations with folks at the CDC and National Institute of Standards to really come up with what we're looking at as the measurements that we want to be talking about here. Okay. We begin with what we refer to in economics as the economic problem. And I'll keep the economic lesson to a minimum here, folks, on this. But the idea of the economic problem is that we have unlimited desires and limited resources. And from the standpoint of the laboratory, with limited resources, how are you going to allocate those? And what are the effects when you do put funds towards one activity at the exclusion of something else? How do you prioritize? And then in total, what are the impacts overall? So we can talk about things like return on investment and where these things are happening. And certainly for our policymakers, this is a very key decision. How are you going to allocate between the arts and your roads and your water systems and your justice system? Within the justice system, how are you going to allocate? So we want to talk about some of those things. Now, the Council of Economic Advisors, out of the White House report, issued last November a paper on the cost of the opioid crisis. $504 billion in a single year. This is 2.3% of gross domestic product that is being lost to the opioid crisis, and that's a single year, and it's growing. In going through this, what they were able to show represented almost it's a 597% increase over any prior study. So we begin with that in what we're talking about today. And when I look at a crisis state, and I'm talking about a state like West Virginia, one of those states that is amongst the worst in terms of deaths per capita. If I look at a state like that, it is costing as much as 15% of gross state product. So in our case, that's probably $1 billion less productivity coming out of the state of West Virginia just because of the losses to opioid crisis and what that means. So the White House report is a bit of a 20,000-foot view, and we happen to know from Project Foresight a good bit more detail, and it's working with that detail to be able to come up with a little bit more definitive sense of the cost that we have to the justice system. So when they looked in there, they assigned a cost of approximately $8 billion a year to the justice system. And that goes from the courts to jails to prisons to the forensic laboratories, everything working all of your way through on that. And what we wanted to be able to do was to be able to take a look at that. One of the key things that we have from Project Foresight is the knowledge that it affects labs differently. And it's not just differences in terms of the level of a particular drug use in a community. A lot of it has to do with size. So you have the good fortune of having a size market that is served, or size jurisdiction that is served by the laboratory here, that tends to be closer to the ideal in terms of being able to be very, very cost effective. But we also have jurisdictions that are very, very small trying to deal with the same issue, and their costs are going to be much higher because they don't have the sense of what is known as economies of scale. There is a right size to be able to do things most cost effectively. So what we've attempted to do here in the White House report is to say, you're understating that even at $600 or $504 billion a year, it's actually more than that. And we're simply taking the aspect that we have from here. So in Project Foresight, what we do is we refer to it as a fully loaded cost. We look at everything. We look at not just trying to time what it takes to be able to investigate a case. We look at all of the things, all of your costs associated with your personnel, all of your capital expenditures, your consumables, all the overhead, everything that goes into the cost of running a laboratory to try to show what it is here. Here's some of the data that we have, and this is part of what we put out every year in our annual report, is to simply say, what does it cost to do a case in every direction? And one of the things we note there is that if you're doing a toxicology case that's just blood alcohol, the cost of that is quite a bit less than if you're doing, say, a toxicology post-mortem case in which you're running much more extensive drug panels, or a case that was dealing with explosives. Now, I point this out just to get a size of the differences of being able to, just for the laboratory to be able to deal with a case, because in that estimate out of the White House report, they treated everything as if it cost the same. And what we're trying to do is to say, no, you got to really get very, very specific to break these things down to figure out what's going on. So, while there are a lot of things out there taking a look at the benefits side of things, what we're able to do is to be able to put together with the costs and be able to talk to every specific community and to be able to say, your specific cost is this, your return on investment is this, to be able to come up with those metrics. And they're staggering when you look at some of these things here. Why do we do this? With respect to opioids, our hope is not so much as to what is the funding that the laboratory needs, although that is an intermediate step. We would like to be able to point out, and very similar to what the judge just had to tell you, is it is a lot less expensive if we can deal with this in treatment. So what is it costing society if you get to this point? So certainly with respect to opioids, we would like to demonstrate you don't want it to get to this point where you have to deal with incarceration, you have to deal with death, you have to deal with a lot of resources being diverted from the other things that are needed in the community. And so that's the motivation we have behind this. So we took a look at this. We have the Foresight laboratories where we're able to measure directly what those costs are. We also have the census of publicly funded forensic laboratories that comes out every 5 years or so. And we were able to take characteristics from those labs to estimate what it costs. Then we have the other laboratories that we don't know much about. But for a single year, we're talking about a cost just for opioids nationally of about $270 million. And that's just the laboratory's small piece of that entire justice system. If you take a look at what the White House estimate would be, it's less than a third of this is what they would have estimated. So we're talking about this piece being that much more. And we're at least able to highlight those, but again, the perspective is, where do you put your dollars? Where do you want to invest as a community working its way through on any of this? So fairly dramatic for a single year. Now, this is, I think, the bigger cost that we have. Amongst the other data that we collect on all of our laboratories are things like backlog, cases that are outstanding. Now, a 30-day period where a case is outstanding is the definition that is used for backlog. It's arbitrary, but it is a marker. And this is looking at the last 2 years, fiscal year 2016 to 2017. And while we can't say definitively that this is only opioids, the opioid crisis, the crisis of dealing with this backlog of sexual assault kits, these are the two biggest things that have been on the radar that we had to address. And the effect is it has had dramatic increases in delays for everything else. So the resources that are needed for the forensic laboratory to deal with special issues or issues that have been ignored, deal with its regular workload, it is fairly dramatic, the impact that this is having. And we're seeing that, you know, this is the justice delayed is justice denied type of aspect. Everything else is also suffering in this process. So it's much broader than just the drug cases themselves. So what we try to do with this is to be able to look through and say, well, how are we going to deal with things? How are we going to put our resources nationally? How can we give policymakers the information that they need? Part of this is appeared in a report that we've just completed for the in dealing with the Justice for All Reauthorization Act of 2016. That report is due to the Attorney General at the end of this month. We've only got a few days left. So part of what I've shown you has gone in there. Certainly the financial laboratory needs technical working group that is about to get started is coming up to try to deal with these issues over the next couple years. But this is a crisis, and it is a serious one. And while you may have not been as affected by it as of yet, it certainly may be coming your way. And being prepared for it and being able to deal with what goes through here, these are some of the critical issues that we have. So I look forward to taking any questions that you might have after this. I've got a little bit on this. This is simply showing what are some of the effects we would have from median laboratories nationwide versus a crisis laboratory. And what we can see things is the cost per case it's going down in crisis states simply because they're getting a volume of activity that's giving it the economies of scale. So in West Virginia, with a population of 1.8 million, we're getting more efficient at treating drug cases, treating post-mortem toxicology cases. It's because of volume. Not that we're getting any better, we're getting volume. Other things that we see here is if you look at productivity, how much is being done, how many cases are being processed per full-time equivalent employee in the labs, we're catching up to this. We're getting better and better at this because we've got volume. Our total expenses are going up, so you can see it's just climbing. In a state like West Virginia, we had the Attorney General a year ago gave an extra $1 million just to be able to take care of some of our backlog that we have with this, just for drug cases. And when we begin to take a look at what's going on here in terms of turnaround time, it's going through the roof. We've got so much coming in the door, we can't deal with it. And this is what happens. This is the effect that opioids are having on the general running of the laboratory. Okay, I'd be happy to take questions a little bit later.
Thanks, Paul. Really striking economic numbers. The other one I find myself adding in this is in 2017, and I know you've seen some of these figures in the news. In 2017, there were an estimated 72,000 deaths from overdoses. For comparison, 58,220 is the number of U.S. service member deaths in the entire 10 years of the Vietnam War. So we are killing a Vietnam War worth of people every year on top of this cost. So I'll get off my soapbox, but Leonard?
Good morning. So I don't have stats for you on or PowerPoint for you this morning. They gave me 15 minutes to talk, and I couldn't do a presentation with PowerPoints in 15 minutes, I assure you. I may not be able to get through these comments in 15 minutes. But I am the director of the Houston Recovery Center. The Houston Recovery Center is a nonprofit local government corporation created by the city of Houston. We were created in 2012 to serve as a jail diversion site for individuals arrested for public intoxication. And what I think we've created is what I like to refer to as a proactive intervention strategy. We can operate in that domain and claim ourselves to be proactive intervention because of the relationships that we have with some really unique first responders across our community. I want to talk a little bit about that service model, and then I'll talk about what we're beginning to see that tie back to what this conversation is all about, which is opioids in our community and the impact it's having on our criminal justice system. I'll tell you that it is having an impact on the criminal justice system, but it's beginning to reach far beyond that. And because of the proactive position that we find ourselves in with our service model, we have a front row seat to see how it is changing across our community. Let me talk a little bit about how we were created, why we were created, and the service model itself. As I said, we serve as a jail diversion site for individuals arrested for public intoxication. We started our services in 2013. Between 2013 and to date, we've had over 31,000 admissions. Now, when you get that kind of volume of people coming through your facility, it begins to paint some pictures for you. And we are really serious about tracking data because we really want to understand the impact of substance use across our community in general, and then drill down to some of those specific substances that we are discovering, like opioid use. But the relationship is afforded us because of the unique position that we share with the first responders like the Houston Police Department, EMS transports. And the first picture that we got of the population that we were seeing came to us through the police department. We started with Houston Police Department, and now we serve all law enforcement jurisdictions in the greater Houston area. We have reduced the number of individuals going to jail for public intoxication by over 95%. We get that data from the jail, it's not ours. They're telling us that we have this fewer people that are being brought in for public intoxication as a result of the services that we offer. But inside of that population, what we've seen is some unique dynamics, really different from what we anticipated. And that is that about 70% of the population that come through our service center are professional people. Chances are we'll see them one time. They was out at an event, had a little too much to drink, put themselves at harm's way, which is really what public intoxication arrests are really all about. They're Class C misdemeanors, and generally it's a health risk that you pose to yourself or somebody else that caused you to come to the attention of law enforcement, and they take you into custody rather than leaving you in that situation. They could just as easily turn you over to a responsible adult, but quite often there's not a responsible adult on hand when they come across a person that's that impaired. So they created a whole organization to respond to that population. When we started working on this in 2010, the city was arresting about 20,000 people a year for public intoxication. We have reduced that number to this year, it will be less than 1,000. The other thing that we've been able to see inside of that population, though, is that I said 70% of professional people coming through one time. That leaves a 30% of the population that come through more often than that. What we've discovered about that population is that quite often that population have real serious substance use issues. Not only do they have substance use issues, but quite often they have a co-occurring issue of mental health. About 8 out of 10 of the individuals that enroll in our 18-month program that was basically designed to support that population have this kind of a profile. 8 out of 10 are homeless. 8 out of 10 has mental health issues. 100% has a substance use issue, and about 9 out of 10 has a criminal history. So, as we drill down, we begin to see what some of the issues are that this population is facing when it comes to their substance use. And again, primarily it is alcohol. But I will tell you that we are seeing a significant number of new people coming in from opioids, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But it is because of this unique relationship that we have with law enforcement in particular, and some of the other providers in general, that we can call ourselves a proactive intervention strategy. And basically what that means is that people get brought to us that are not looking for help. Most of the service providers who support this population respond to people that are looking for help. Because of our relationship with HPD first, law enforcement in general second, and then expanding out to the criminal justice system, because as the judge said, we are now a referral site for their program. And we're having a tremendous amount of success with the number of individuals that the judge is directing to our team, the 18-month program in particular, to provide them assistance with the issue that brought them in front of the judge in the first place. But we've been able to expand that to a jail in-reach program, where we're actually going inside of the jail, looking for individuals that are in the jail because of their addiction issue, and trying to match up with those individuals while they're in jail, what we consider time out, where we may be able to get their attention long enough for them to consider changing their behavior. And if they choose to, we'll offer them access to our program. We have gone farther than that with the jail program, where we're actually doing a pilot project with Vivitrol. Vivitrol is a drug that can be used for persons that are addicted to alcohol or opioids that can lessen their craving and provide them a pathway with less resistance to being able to pursue their recovery. That is another one. Another project that we've started that gives us an even better insight as to what's going on in the community with opioids is a pilot that we're now doing with Houston, the University of Texas School of Public Health. They've got a research project where that they call HEROES, that they are targeting individuals that just OD on opioids. And the way our program works is that we have a peer specialist that is paired with a paramedic that actually go visit these individuals in their homes after they have OD'd. We started this program in May. The annual goal for the program was 50 people. This is September. We have 46 people in the program already. Okay, that's what, 5 months? So we have already moved the goalpost in terms of how many people we think we're going to be able to enroll in this program in a year. We moved it from 50 to 150. That just gives you an indication of when we first started working with our program in 2013, the conclusion was quite early on that we were not going to see a lot of opioids. We modeled our program after San Antonio. San Antonio has a big opioid program. That's nothing new. They've had it for a long time. Dallas has a much bigger opioid problem than we do. But we were thinking that we was probably going to see less because we just wasn't getting any information on the fact that opioid was a big problem in our community. But we are seeing firsthand that that is increasing on a daily basis. We also have a relationship with adult probation, which is a brand new project for us. Adult probation saw what we were doing with the reintegration court and asked us to bring those same resources to a couple of their sites, their probation sites, to test this concept with that population. And again, they're directing us to people that are on probation and are at risk of being violated on probation because they have a drug problem. And so they ask us if we would come in and bring our peer team to support that population and see if we can improve the outcomes that they're having with these individuals. That program is a few months old, but already we're seeing very positive results with that program, and we are absolutely surprised to see the number of individuals that are being enrolled in that program that are on opioids. So the question early on was whether or not opioids was a challenge for our community. I can tell you from my front row seat that it is rapidly becoming a challenge here. And we're seeing it in EMS with overdoses. We're seeing them in the referrals that we're getting from the courts. We're seeing them in referrals that we're getting from probation officers. That this is becoming a problem for our community. So this is a timely event. We should be talking about this. We should be talking about it now because the time to start trying to build an infrastructure for responding to this issue is now, not after this issue falls upon us as a crisis, as a major crisis, and then we try to build out the care continuum. I'll have a chance for questions as we go on, but at this time I'll conclude my comments. Thank you.
Well, our next speaker is one that deals with trying to analyze these things in the laboratory. Patrick is one of our analysts. I always appreciate Patrick's efforts and his presentations. Patrick?
Hello. I feel a little outclassed up here. So, my name is Patrick Tynan. I'm a forensic analyst for the Houston Forensic Science Center in the seized drugs section. So we get to see the substances themselves as they come in after they've been seized. So we get a nice little window into what the drug abuse scene in Houston looks like. This is the 2016 numbers from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So this is already 2 years out of date, but the numbers are still pretty scary. And I can promise you they've gone up since they last compiled all this information. And since this is national, it takes a long time. From the National Incidence of Drug Abuse, this one they have 2017 numbers. You can already see in 1 year that number is just skyrocketed. So synthetic opioids, fentanyl, they're past heroin and pretty much every other drug in terms of what's the most dangerous thing out there in terms of overdose deaths. And Heroin's been around for a long time, and heroin's always been the big, bad, scary, and anything that makes heroin look kind of tame is bad in my books. So fentanyl is the core substance of all of these synthetic opioids, and a lot of the fentanyl analogs are what the major problems are in our lab. Fentanyl itself is a synthetic opioid. Sorry, it's microphone doesn't pick up very close. Fentanyl has pain relief characteristics, and it's used in hospitals in very, very small doses, usually through an IV or a patch for pain relief and whatever you'd use normal opioid for, like morphine. You can get it, but it's very, very rarely prescribed because the doses are so small that you're probably only going to end up seeing this if you're in an intensive care or ER ward or something like that. In terms of how small a dose is, that little white powder next to the penny is a lethal dose, according to the DEA, and that's of fentanyl itself. And if you start looking at analogs, it makes that look like a lot. Carfentanil there on the right, notice the ruler, that's a 2-inch ruler for these vials. So these are pretty tiny vials. And inside that tiny vial, that one speck of powder for carfentanil is all it would take. And you can see why for the illicit drug community this is pretty popular, because you sneak a small handful of this over the border and you can make doses for months just on that amount. So I have this chart, which I stole from Dr. Stout's presentation, that shows all of the different relative strengths for these opioids. And I'm not going to call them out one at a time because I would butcher a lot of these names, and there's a lot of them. So morphine is the original natural opioid that comes from the poppy plant, and we've based this chart around that, so that's going to be a value of 1. And everything you see below it are the traditional prescription opioids that you see prescribed a lot in doctor's offices, like hydrocodone or tramadol. As you start going upwards, you get oxycodone, which is prescribed a lot, and then heroin, which is 5 times stronger than morphine. Heroin is still pretty far down on this chart, and we have to remember that heroin's been killing people for decades. So anything that's making this look tiny has to be really bad. And then hydromorphone, U47-700, and then all of the things that have fentanyl in the name that, like I said, I will butcher if I try to pronounce them. They just keep getting stronger and stronger up until you get to fentanyl. Fentanyl is 100 times stronger than morphine, which is why they have to give it such low doses and why people are having such a problem overdosing on it, because it's hard to dose that small amount. Like, I would have trouble measuring it in my lab with an analytical balance, so I can't imagine people doing it on food scales in a kitchen somewhere. And acylfentanyl is just as strong. And then at the top we have carfentanil, which is the one that I showed you the dose for. Carfentanil is a lot stronger. A real lot stronger. It's used by veterinarians to tranquilize elephants. So it's clearly not meant for our consumption. And one of the reasons it's popular is because in Jurassic World they use it to kill a T-Rex. And people get the idea that that must be strong, I should take that. This looks like a great idea. That dinosaur didn't know what he was doing, but I'm smart, so I won't overdose. We have some pretty obvious cases where it's submitted as suspected fentanyl. These tan powders in kilos that aren't testing for heroin with the field kit, which thankfully we've stopped using, but we have some idea this might be fentanyl, let's be scared of it. Then we get our tablets that come in. These are really good knockoffs of prescription opioids, like this is a hydrocodone tablet that had fentanyl in it in our lab. So we can't be so sure whether or not those are actually going to have the opioid they claim to have in them. And some of the fake tablets aren't even opioids. These are Xanax, happy pills, like getting drunk without the breath. This is an anti-anxiety medication that we see submitted a lot. And we get fentanyl ones of these too. And that's nowhere near what it should be doing. And some of these ripoffs are better than what the manufacturers are making in terms of quality. So because of that, we have to treat everything we get like it may contain fentanyl until we can test to see if it does. This one had carfentanil, and the analyst who worked it is over there in the back, so she did it right. But we have to treat everything like we don't know what's in there until after we've tested it, and after we've tested it, we've already handled a lot. So we got to treat everything like it could have fentanyl. And then you get these, and you start to cry inside, because treating everything like that might be fentanyl is a nightmare. These are two of my personal nightmares, because these are my cases. The one on the right is a shipment of fake Mexican candy that came in, and the one on the left is a safe full of syringes. I don't know why they had it, but it was not that fun. I had to work all of these, but luckily I only had to work one thing out of this case. So we have to take a lot of precautionary measures. In our lab, that comes for naloxone kits that we keep scattered around our section. They're in these boxes you can yank off the wall in a second. They have 2 doses each, so that'll keep you going while everyone grabs the rest of the kits and hurries them over there. We have increased our protective equipment. We're always wearing a mask that's rated for particles like fentanyl. We always have to have lab coats and goggles on and gloves. We have to pretty much keep all of those on whenever we're doing any casework whatsoever. And in the lab, we still have to keep our lab coat even if we're not working anything. All right, on to the numbers. So from all the opioids we've been getting, heroin is still the major one. But from all of our identifications, fentanyls are number 3. We get more fentanyls than we get prescription oxycodone, which is bad, because prescription oxycodone is pretty popular. And hydrocodone is definitely one of the major things we've seen in Houston for a long time, so it's yet to been unseated by the fentanyls. But a lot of the fentanyls we do come in are masquerading as one of the other things on that chart. A lot of it is not advertised as fentanyl, and most of the identifications we make, I think, I'm just guessing, are not called as fentanyl. I wish I had that number to look at. All right. Wait a second. So I checked this earlier, and I had a chart there, but it's gone now. And that happened at the last meeting I did, so I checked it. I made sure to check it, but it's definitely not there. Okay, so if you look at the wedge on the left, that white wedge is 6%. That 6% wedge is all of our opioids. So opioids still aren't the major thing we see. I mean, meth and crack are still going to be the big ones out there, and marijuana. But that 6% you're staring so intently at is the same size as the one next to it that you can see for synthetic cannabinoids. And synthetic marijuana and kush, that we've been seeing for years now. That's sort of been the major scare before all of these opioids. That hasn't gone away. And opioids have gotten to be just as big as that. All right? So here's our opioids that we've been receiving for 2018. Already, just when summer came, it skyrocketed because people get out of school and they're bored and they like to do bad things. So there are usually a lot more drugs done in summer, but the opioid problem is, I guess the point to see, it's not going away, it's just getting worse. And if you look year by year, that becomes even more dramatic. 2015, we got 1 of them. 2016, we got another dozen on top of that. Last year, we had 24. This year, we have 37 on this chart. And I made this chart last week on Tuesday. By the end of the day, that chart was already out of date because we'd gotten another one. This stuff keeps coming in, and we've already passed last year significantly, and it's just ramping up. So our lab is still seeing way more of this than we want to. And this is a problem that's just starting to happen. And so the fact that we're here talking about it before it becomes an even bigger issue is, I think, a step in the right direction. I have a slide here about field tests. I mentioned earlier we don't do those anymore, at least Houston Police Department doesn't. One reason for that is they can be kind of ambiguous in terms of substances. Certain substances can give similar reactions in an ideal setting like our lab. Our lab is ideal because we can keep the reagents separate and we don't have to keep them in a hot patrol car and we can replace them once a month. But when you have a field kit where it's been sitting pre-mixed in a car of someone's trunk of someone's car for a month, then you're going to even get worse results than this. So under ideal situations, you see these 3 spot wells that we've tested with the same reagent. The top left is meth, and then the top right is fentanyl. You can already tell looking at those, they're pretty similar and would be hard to tell apart in a large dose, especially in a field environment. But one of the pieces of this reagent test is sulfuric acid. And that sulfuric acid can burn a lot of things, like printer paper. So there's a lot of false positives that can come from that as well. Field testing is dangerous because you have this unknown substance out in the field that could be that T-Rex drug, and you have to take it out in order to sample it. your sample is not going to give you anything that's super useful. And when we get it in the lab, that field test doesn't help us at all. It's still going to take the same amount of time. We still have to treat it like an unknown. And there's nothing that actually expedites the process from us knowing what a field test kit came back as. All right. So I guess questions will come later. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, in Patrick's defense, we tested it just before, and that graph was there. I don't know where it got to.
Literally first thing I did when I got here.
Yeah, it was there. Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Catherine Harris. I am a fellow in drug policy at the Baker Institute here at Rice, so right across the street from this building we're in now. I'm going to talk a little bit about national and local trends with opioid use and overdose, and then I'll talk about some of the policy responses to the epidemic. So when we hear about the opioid epidemic, it's often discussed in terms of overdoses. I think that's how we've been discussing it here, rather than, as an epidemic of use, although both have increased. The number of people with a substance use disorder that involved a prescription opioid or heroin increased from about 1.7 million in 2002 to 2.1 million in 2016. So that's about a 24% increase. So it's significant, but by comparison, the rate of overdose deaths that involved an opioid increased 254% during that same period. They were close to 12,000 in 2002. They were over 42,000 in 2016. So the increase in overdoses can't be attributed just to an increase in use. There's other factors involved. Fentanyl is a big one, as we've seen discussed already today. And I think you guys might have just seen this chart, so I'm not going to go over it too much. This is the estimates for 2017. There were an estimated 72,000 overdoses, of which 49,000 involved opioids. And of course, the big story here is the increase in overdoses involving synthetics. In 2013, there were only 3,000 overdose deaths that involved synthetics. The estimate for 2017 was over 29,000. So that's an increase of 847%. If you want an alarmist statistic, there you have it. But I think it is also important to note that you see also the increases in overdoses involving cocaine and stimulants, particularly meth. This map shows how overdose deaths vary across the states. These numbers are for all overdose deaths, not just those involving opioids. The national rate of overdose is about 16.9 per 100,000 residents. You can see Texas by the lighter color. It's relatively lower compared to the national average. Here it's about 10 overdoses per 100,000 people. For opioids, it's around 4.9. That doesn't mean, though, that we don't have a problem here. In 2017, there was an estimated 3,000 drug overdoses in the state. That was almost triple the number in 1999. And in contrast to some other areas of the country, in the Northeast and the Appalachian Rust Belt areas, again, cocaine and meth account for a higher proportion of overdose deaths. You can see on the right, this is data from 2016. So cocaine and meth were involved in more deaths than any single class of opioids. But if you count up the heroin and the pain pills and the fentanyl, which are all, of course, opioids, you see that this still represents the greatest contributor to overdose deaths here in the state. This is data for overdose deaths in Harris County for 2017. I got these from Lieutenant Casco with HPD Narcotics. I think he is here, maybe. And anyway, so you see that the county numbers, you see it's similar to the state trends in that cocaine and meth account for a large role of overdoses. And then you also see heroin is at the top and also fentanyl analogs. And so from looking at this list, you see that there's a lot of different drugs and type of drugs that can be involved in overdose deaths. But again, the main categories are opioids, including heroin and cocaine and methamphetamines. And it's important to keep in mind here, I think, that roughly half of all overdoses involve 2 or more drugs. So there's a lot of mixing that goes on. So this shows you fatal overdoses in Harris County over the last 5 years. All opioids combined have accounted for more deaths than cocaine in 2017. Cocaine-involved deaths, though, have increased about 75% since 2013. Deaths from opioids have not increased as quickly, but if you look here at the top, The deaths from heroin and from fentanyl both have tripled from 2013 to 2017. Again, at least half of these deaths involve 2 or more drugs. And to that point, I wanted to show you this slide, which shows how many drugs are involved in an overdose by the main drug involved. So this data is from the CDC. It's from 2014, but there's reason to believe that these are trends that are pretty consistent. So the dark blue at the bottom indicates the percentage of overdose deaths that involved only that one drug. So if you look all the way to the right, it might be a little hard to see, but the column to the farthest right is for methamphetamine. So from that dark blue at the bottom, you can see that roughly 60% of overdose deaths that were attributed to meth did not involve any other drugs. On the other hand, if you look at the 2 middle columns that are set by themselves, that's for alprazolam and diazepam, those are in the benzo class, or think Xanax and Valium, they almost always involve at least one other drug, and the majority of overdoses involving those involve 2 to 4 other drugs. And for the opioids, which are all grouped to the left, you can again see that in the majority of cases, it's not just one opioid that's involved in an overdose, it's multiple drugs. And I think this is a really important part of the conversation about overdose trends because it indicates that polydrug use is a major contributor to overdose deaths. So I think some of this, may be because drugs are laced. So for example, some of the counterfeit pills that the forensics lab encounters might have, they might be pressed to be oxycodone, but they might also have fentanyl and diazepam in them. So those combinations occur, and that can be one contributor. I think, there's also the instances where people are mixing on purpose because they, they're chasing a bigger high. So both things are important to keep in mind. Causes, I'm going to skip over this for now just because in the interest of time, but I'm happy to talk about any of this part during the question period. So I wanted to talk more about responses. So to reduce overdose deaths, there's several things we can do. One, we can take steps to reduce the presence of fentanyl that's in the illicit drug supply. There's a provision of about 70 bills that Congress approved just earlier this week. One of the provisions that they passed would require the Postal Service to screen packages coming in from overseas. That's intentionally intended to reduce the amount of fentanyl that we're seeing coming in through the U.S. mail in small packages because, again, such a small amount is needed for a high that it's relatively easy to move around. I know that law enforcement here in Harris County and across the country is working to identify people that are making and selling fentanyl-laced drugs. I think it's important to note that law enforcement efforts at reducing fentanyl are not going to reduce drug use. But to the extent that fentanyl and other synthetics are so deadly, it makes sense to focus some of our resources on reducing its presence where possible. I think this is going to be an uphill battle just because of the many ways in which it gets into the hands of drug users. And, again, it comes through the mail, people can order it online. So it's certainly an uphill battle, and I think that's why it's also crucial to invest in other efforts to reduce risk of overdose. One thing that can be done is offering fentanyl test strips. This can be done, law enforcement, public health programs can do this. There's a study of a program in Vancouver that hands out these fentanyl test strips to users that found that those who got a positive result for fentanyl were 10 times more likely to lower their dose of drug. So that's important because it shows that if you give people more information about the drugs that they're putting into their body, they might alter their behavior. It doesn't mean that they're not going to use them, but they might take steps to use in a safer way. Some U.S. cities now have started passing these out to drug users. Increasing naloxone access is another important step. We've talked a little bit about naloxone or Narcan already here today. Nearly all states now have laws that make it available to people without a prescription, including Texas. But for people that don't have insurance, the cost is still a problem. This was a couple months ago, but I called around at a couple pharmacies and asked how much it would cost a Narcan kit with 2 doses, and they told me about $120 without insurance. Also, a lot of pharmacies still will tell you that you need a prescription for this drug, which you don't. And a good portion of the public isn't either aware of what Narcan is and also doesn't know that it's available to them, even people that use drugs or have loved ones that do. So certainly there needs to be increasing awareness about the availability of this drug, and also I think we need greater efforts to distribute it to people who can benefit from having it. I think it's great right now, we see that more HPD officers are carrying it. I think there's a lot more people working on front lines with drug users who have this available to them. But the people that are most likely to be in a position to save someone's life from Narcan are other drug users. So we also need to get it into the hands of people who are using. Needle exchange programs are also another important step. Needle exchange programs allow drug users to exchange their used needles for clean ones. They can reduce a person's risk of overdose by connecting them with public health resources. It's a way to get information out to users. They're a relatively cheap intervention compared to some other public health interventions. One needle costs about 97 cents. They cost less when they're bought in bulk. And they're just good public health policy. I want to show you this map here. The green dots that you see represent needle exchange programs. And the pink areas are places with high vulnerability to hepatitis C and HIV, which you can contract from intravenous drug use. So you can see that where you have more green dots, where there's more needle exchange programs, there's less vulnerability to these diseases. And the cluster here, Kentucky and West Virginia and Tennessee, that's an area that's been very hard hit by the current epidemic. Those areas historically have not had needle exchange programs, but that is starting to change now precisely because they're seeing an increase in hepatitis C and HIV. We know that this is good public health policy. We know that it does not increase or encourage drug use. Unfortunately, the U.S. has one of the lowest rates of needle exchange availability in the developed world. In Texas, Bill Martin, who is the director of our drug policy program, who is here today, he's been working on trying to get the state of Texas to approve these programs for over a decade. There are programs throughout the state that do operate under the radar, but we're still waiting for the Texas legislature to approve them. Other things that can be done, safe consumption sites. These are places where users can bring their own drugs to a clinic that will provide clean needles if they need needles and also supervision for drug use. They can reduce overdoses because there's somebody right there if a person overdoses. They can also reduce needle sharing. There are none that are legal in the U.S. right now, but there are several localities that are considering implementing them. And both needle exchange programs and safe consumption sites are good because they can be an outlet to provide users with naloxone, with the fentanyl test strips or other drug testing services. They can also be an area to provide information about safe use practices, telling people don't use alone, don't mix drugs. You can also connect them with healthcare providers, and they can also be a starting point for people to get into treatment. If you connect people with providers, they might be more likely, if they've been contemplating treatment, it's a way to talk to them about that. And that brings me to my next slide about how to reduce use and addiction. So medication-assisted treatment. I think a lot of people in this room know what that is. I don't want to go into it too much, but drugs like methadone and buprenorphine satisfy a person's physical need to take opioids, and by doing so, they allow them to focus on other things besides figuring out how they're going to get high. Naltrexone, which is the third approved medication-assisted treatment, actually blocks the opioid receptors in the brain, so it prevents a person from feeling the euphoria if they use. So MAT is not only the gold standard of treatment for opioid use disorder, but it also reduces the likelihood of an overdose, since if a person who's on a MAT regimen, they're less likely to buy heroin off the street. We need more of this. In Texas, only 14% of treatment facilities offer methadone. Only 34% offer buprenorphine. People without insurance have extremely limited access. So if you have no insurance coverage, it's really hard to get this. So if you are a single, young, unemployed male, then it is really hard to get into a treatment program that provides this. That's also the population that we know is at the highest risk of overdose. So, needless to say, ensuring access to healthcare is an important part of treatment and also overdose prevention. And we don't just need more coverage, we also need care that integrates mental and physical health. We know that a lot of people who misuse opioids and become addicted have co-occurring mental health disorders or have other issues, including physical pain that has not been treated. Other things, we need to focus on expanding access to alternative therapies for pain management other than opioids. Right now, we don't have a whole lot of good alternatives. Medical cannabis is one area that shows promise in managing some forms of chronic pain. There's been several studies now that have found an association between legal medical marijuana and lower rates of opioid use and overdose in states that have access, legal access. We need more research on this topic, certainly, and the federal government needs to allow that. Insurance companies, historically have preferred covering prescription opioids versus other pain management therapies because opioids are a cheaper option. So they need to, I think there's incumbent on them also to expand coverage of pain management alternatives while still covering prescription opioids for patients who these alternatives do not help, because we want to make sure that chronic pain patients still have access to what they need. And as many in this room are aware, we need more data sharing and coordination between the many systems that come into contact with drug users: police, first responders, courts, hospitals, treatment providers. And I think already today you've heard from Judge Brock Thomas and Leonard Kincaid about some of the efforts locally of these collaborations. And these are necessary to improve treatment. For example, I think the idea of having first responders and emergency room departments being able to connect people that they see with that is overdosing with a treatment provider is really essential, because that overdose presents a window of opportunity to get a person into treatment, and it's a short window. Because after the overdose, somebody might go back to their regular habits and they think, I'm fine, I don't need treatment, or I don't want treatment. So that connection early on is really, really essential. Also, we need to be able to get a better handle on what's happening and how the epidemic is changing and evolving, and all of that requires data sharing. And I will close with 2 points. The first, I think, is that a lot of the response so far that you see legislatively to this, certainly there has been more money put towards treatment, but the other thing you've seen a lot is attempts to restrict access to opioid medications. But we need to keep in mind that the vast majority of people that are given legitimate prescriptions for opioids, not from fake pain clinics, but who get them for legitimate pain purposes, do not go on to become addicted or to use heroin. The estimates vary, but rates of addiction among people who have a legitimate need for prescription opioids is about 8%. About 4% of people who ever misuse prescription opioids go on to use heroin. I think that caution in opioid prescribing practices is warranted, but we also need to balance this with the needs of people who rely on prescription opioids to perform daily functions. And so far, I am concerned that we are not balancing these interests as well as we could be. And the second point I want to make is that there are a lot of different short-term steps that we can take to reduce overdoses. You've heard about some of them from other members of the panel. I've discussed some of them here. I think these are really important public health things that we need to be doing. But in terms of addressing the increase in overall drug use and addiction is going to require more long-term solutions that I think are going to really require us to invest in and think about not only how we treat substance use, but how we treat mental health, how we provide healthcare coverage, and how we integrate these different systems of care. And I'm happy to answer questions later. So thank you.
All right. Hopefully you see we're trying to get this at all angles. So, trivia break, trivia question. How many people in here have heard of and know what the Houston cocktail is?
Dear.
There's a few. There's a few. So we see this in an alarming portion of our driving under the influence of drugs cases. It is Soma, which is a muscle relaxant, Xanax, alprazolam, a benzodiazepine, anti-anxiety drug, and Norco, an opioid. All three of those on board at the same time. So when you're changing lanes and you're impatient at the person, think about that and their mental state as they're driving. Amy, we've got your video here first, right? Let's see if this is going to behave. Guess we've got to get through the ad first here. Hopefully the
I don't know
audio.
what to tell you.
We lose the audio on it? We
John,
had audio earlier.
you're going to need the audio. Maybe not.
Well, we had audio.
Well, we're good. It does, but this is fine. You're good.
We're good? Where did we lose the audio to?
This is just 40 seconds. Now you get to see the rest of this. You ready for me? Hi. This is going to be a short course, a very short course in American journalism and how to win a Pulitzer Prize. We never meant to do anything except cover our community. These wonderful people, usually I'm not invited to science parties, so this is pretty exciting. Journalists aren't usually invited to science parties. Have shown you the maps that obviously have shown that the epicenter of the epidemic in the United States is in Ohio and Kentucky and West Virginia and places like that. But I'm not sure if you know this, but Cincinnati sits on the Ohio River, which is directly between Ohio and Kentucky. We started seeing heroin overdoses in about heroin epidemic in about 2012. And in about 2015, we became the first and only newspaper in America that had a full-time heroin reporter. That will tell you how bad it is in Cincinnati. And then fentanyl started to show up in about 2014. We are way, way ahead of you on this sort of thing. Carfentanil has made an appearance on the streets as well. What happened was, because the heroin reporter was so terrific, we had covered what it looks like in the jails, we had looked at what it looks like in the families, we had talked about compassion fatigue with EMTs, we had talked about every imaginable rehab program out there, we had talked to prostitutes, we had talked to just about everybody on the planet who had anything to do with heroin. And she came to me, she and another writer came to me sometime in May of 2016, it's not true, 2017, and said, you know, what we'd really need to do is have all of us go all at once and make it look, have people see what it really looks like, not in these little tiny pieces in journalism of America, but essentially all of it. What does it look like? And so I went into the big editor and said, what do you think? And he said, go make it so. And for that, we took 60 reporters and photographers, and we took a week in July. Did nothing but heroin. Now that's not entirely true. We planned for this, so we had things that filled the newspaper, and we did have, not everybody worked every 8-hour shift on this, but essentially we had I guess we had about 10 assignments a day. And the reason that we were able to do that, usually the question I get most is, how did you get access to people who are overdosing and stuff like that? That was not the hard part. Terry, the heroin reporter, had done such a fabulous job on her beat and was so highly respected in both the law enforcement and the judicial community that we got everywhere we wanted to go, except into emergency rooms because of HIPAA laws. But what we did was we planned this and we explained to reporters how we wanted it reported. We did all sorts of stuff like that, and I'm happy to, any of you who are interested in journalism, I'd be happy to tell you about how those conversations went. But essentially what we did was we set up incredible Excel spreadsheets of where we were going to be, what time we were going to be there, who was supposed to check in, whether or not they checked in with me, and all sorts of kind of stuff. It's all sort of crazy as a logistical lift. But essentially we tried to be everywhere at once. So we started at midnight Sunday to Monday at the jail, which is exactly where we ended up, because the point was to show you that this is what a typical week in Cincinnati looks like for us, for all of us, which is how many businesses are turning down people because they can't pass drug tests, to how many people are losing their lives, to how many people are overdosing on the street, and frankly never making it into any sort of rehab facility and or emergency room because they simply get up after they've been Narcaned and they walk away. So when you, we also had, and I'm very, very proud of this, we had a data team of 5 people who called 45 agencies every day. during that week to make sure that we got the number of people who had overdosed and the number of people who had died. Understand that the number who have died and the number overdosed that appear in the project are only those that came through hospitals or through the coroner's office. Not everyone is reported, and obviously people who overdose on the street are not, in fact, always taken to the emergency room. I don't know if you noticed, but we had that week, which was considered an extremely slow week in our area, 18 deaths, 180 overdoses in hospitals, 200 people were admitted to jail with heroin attached somehow to their ticket, and 15 babies were born in our hospitals with medical problems because their mothers were addicted. That's one really bad, slow week in Cincinnati. I can't tell you how pervasive this is, and the whole point of the project was to say not only how pervasive it is, but how pernicious. And pervasive in that people who think this isn't happening to you, as I believe Catherine just mentioned, is that we showed you that it was happening inside of the public library stalls. Overdoses were happening there. Overdoses were happening behind Targets, at speedways. We had 911 calls from everywhere. We have footage from everywhere. We have closed circuit stuff from everywhere. You saw a 40-second clip. That's the teaser. We produced a 20-page special section and a 30-minute documentary. The documentary has won the Edward R. Murrow Award, which is the national big deal. We won the Pulitzer. We've also won Emmys. Again, I want to repeat, we never meant to. What happened here is that we could not tell people what it looked like across there unless we told you about every project, everything that was happening in the jails every day, in the courtrooms every day, in rehab facilities every day. So we essentially just went, and we did nothing but do what they call cinematic reporting, which is essentially we just watched. We didn't say, what do you feel about heroin? What do you think? How do you feel about overdosing? We didn't do any of that. We just sort of watched people as they went forward. We did it in a time-stamped way so that we basically, again, go from the entire seven days until we're finished. I will tell you some gut-wrenching things. If you haven't read it, there is a moment in which the mother of that really beautiful baby is in basically an infant syndrome kind of clinic. And it's been about a year, and the baby's doing really, really well. And the mother talks to us extensively about how great it's going to be because ever since she found out she was pregnant, she has stopped using, and she just wants this completely better life for her daughter, and it's just been so great since she's been off the drug for a long time. 10 days after we reported on her, she overdosed and died. We got her autopsy because, again, I'm teaching you about journalism. We got her autopsy, and we discovered that she had been using for a while, and that when she was talking to us, she was lying to us. She had a complete row of not old, but like within the last month or so, needle marks all along her abdomen. But she overdosed and died. And that was the low point for us because we cried and cried and cried and cried. The high point was that 3 sets of parents found where their children were because they saw them in our videos. They did not know where their children were. They did not know if their children were alive. They did not know if they were safe. And they were able to find them because we were allowed to shoot them. We have a problem that's not getting better. Heroin is bad, but there's a lot, we all are making it worse because we're not allowing jails to provide treatment. We're not, I mean, what the judge is doing is God's work. We're not treating this with medicine, which in fact exists. We are treating it in some ways with abstinence, which is dumb, because this is a problem that's a problem about what happens in your brain. It's a chemical thing. It changes the chemistry of your brain. They're called mu receptors, in which basically heroin, sort of latches on, and then you have to have it. And you don't have to have it to get high. You have to have it to be normal, in order to not to be sick. And essentially, it is the worst. And we created this in some ways because we allowed basically, and certainly in Kentucky and Ohio, a mass amount of pain prescription medications to be written for people who maybe did not need them. And those opioids, then we decided that we would, as a state legislature, we would start to control them. And essentially we have registries and stuff if you get these things. Well, if you don't get them legally, you're going to get them illegally. And essentially the answer was heroin. And heroin was pretty cheap. Originally it came, I think in liquid form or black tar heroin at some point, and then it became powdered heroin, and now what we have on the streets, it could be anything. Just so you know, I know you all have a problem with maybe cocaine or other things. We are actually seeing multiple overdoses in the cocaine using community because fentanyl is being slipped into cocaine in order to get people hooked on fentanyl, and we have a lot of cocaine deaths because they were unaware that fentanyl was in fact in their system. We have now people who are fentanyl seekers, as in they are not looking for heroin anymore, they are looking for the next thing. We have seen carfentanil. Anyway, I just want to say that, if you have some time, please take some time to see our work. I think you'd be astonished at how it is everywhere in our community. Children call to say their parents have overdosed. It's heartbreaking. It's scary because we have footage of an overdose that occurred on the freeway. And how that was because people couldn't wait to shoot up, so they shot up while they were driving 75 miles an hour. I don't want you all to think you come to Cincinnati and you see people overdosing in the streets. You don't. It's a lovely city. It has much to commend it. But I want to tell you that your numbers astound me because Ohio, Catherine, what was the number for how many deaths per 100,000? And
For opioids, 4.9 for the state.
4.9. We have 32.9 deaths per 100,000 in Ohio. In Kentucky, it's 23.6 per 100,000, which is double the national rate. Last, I guess I'll say that. We have to learn how to talk about this in a way that does not, this is hard because we're treating it as a crime. And as I have told the heroin reporter, excuse me, but it is a crime. But we need to treat it as the problem that it is, which is an addiction disorder. Once we begin to talk about it in that way, we can actually start about fixing it. I think it's a terrible thing that it never really leaves you. One of the stories we tell, which is something we were looking through for journalistically, was one story that we could follow every single solitary day that week. And that's called The Lost Boys. And it's we have a man who had been off of heroin for a year or so. And he used and died. And he probably died because he was using this, he decided he was going to try the same dose that he was using when he went off of heroin. And in fact, his body was not used to that. And he died. But we followed him through the family and through the funeral and that this week. It is never over for people who suffer from this addiction. We're going to have a problem for a long, long, long time to come. Thank you.
All right, so we'll take a break now until 10:45. There's plenty of coffee back there. There's still some food back there. Come back ready to ask questions and discuss. I mean, this is an enormous problem and none of us have the answers. So good discussion is quite possible. So 10:45, thank you.